I never thought of myself as a brave man. I thought of myself as a practical one. My name doesn't matter much anymore, but for most of my adult life, I was a crematorium attendant at a small facility tucked behind a cemetery no one visited after sunset. I took the job in my early 40s, after 2 decades working around industrial equipment. Boilers, pressure systems, heat exchangers. Steel. Gauges. Rules that made sense. Machines that behaved the same way every time as long as you respected them. That's why the work suited me. People assume crematoriums are places of constant dread, but the truth is quieter, cleaner, more procedural than emotional. By the time a body reached me, the chaos was already over. Grief had happened somewhere else. What remained was process, temperature, time, documentation. I didn't deal with families. I didn't give speeches. I made sure the machine did what it was designed to do, nothing more, nothing less. I trusted that. I trusted numbers. I trusted indicator lights. I trusted the simple comfort of knowing that if something went wrong, there would be a reason for it. A loose sensor. A faulty relay. Human error. Problems you could point at and fix. I did not believe in ghosts. I did not believe in signs. And I especially did not believe that the dead lingered. Fire doesn't allow that. The crematorium itself was a long, rectangular building made of concrete and stainless steel, humming softly even when nothing was running. At night, the fluorescent lights flattened everything into pale shades of gray. No shadows. No corners for the imagination to hide in. Just polished floors, metal doors, and the low, constant sound of ventilation moving warm air where it needed to go. I liked the night shifts best. No phone calls. No visitors wandering in by mistake. Just me, a clipboard, and machines that didn't ask questions. I worked slowly, carefully, the way you do when you've done something long enough to know that rushing is the only real danger. Most nights passed without incident. You check the chamber. You verify the ID. You log the start time. You monitor the cycle. When it's done, you clean, document, and prepare for the next one. That's it. Nothing mysterious. Nothing dramatic. People love to imagine strange things happen in places like that. They ask if I ever heard voices or felt cold spots or saw shadows move on their own. I usually smiled and told them no. Because up until that night, the only thing I ever felt in that building was tired. Tired in the honest way that comes from repetition. Tired in the way that tells you everything is exactly as it should be. The machines reinforced that feeling. The control panels glowed with steady greens and ambers. The gauges rose and fell predictably. Every system had redundancies, backups, alarms designed to scream the moment something drifted out of range. You couldn't miss a problem even if you tried. That's what made the job safe. That's what made it manageable. I believed, truly believed, that if I followed procedure, nothing could surprise me. Heat behaved like heat. Steel behaved like steel. And death, once it reached my end of the process, behaved like chemistry. Looking back, I realize how comforting that belief was. How much of myself I anchored to it. Because when you spend your nights alone in a building designed to reduce a human life to ash, you need something solid to hold on to. For me, that something was the quiet certainty that the world obeyed rules, even in a place like that. Especially in a place like that. I never stood in front of the furnace glass longer than necessary. Not out of fear but out of respect for the heat. I never spoke to the chambers. Never lingered after a cycle finished. I treated the work the way you're supposed to, professionally, emotionally distant, efficient. There were no rituals. No superstitions. No personal habits meant to ward anything off. Just machines doing what they were built to do. That night started the same way every other shift had started for years. I clocked in. I checked the logs. I verified the schedule. One furnace. One routine cycle. No complications. No special instructions. Nothing about it suggested it would be different. Nothing about it warned me that before the night was over, the very systems I trusted, the glass, the numbers, the perfect order of it all, would quietly fail me. Not by breaking, but by working exactly as designed. And that was the part one would never be able to explain away. The schedule that night was almost empty. That alone should tell you how unremarkable it began. I remember scanning the logbook under the harsh fluorescent lights, my finger tracing down the page until it stopped on a single entry. One chamber. One cycle. Standard parameters. No notes in the margins, no red flags, no hurried handwriting from the day's shift. Just clean ink and tidy boxes checked off the way they always were. I like nights like that. Fewer variables. Fewer chances for human error to creep in. I walked the length of the building the way I always did at the start of a shift, not because it was required but because routine has a rhythm to it. The prep area was spotless, stainless steel tables reflecting the ceiling lights without distortion. The hallway leading to the furnaces smelled faintly of disinfectant and warm metal, a scent so familiar it barely registered anymore. The crematorium hummed softly, a mechanical breathing that never quite stopped. Even when the furnaces were idle, the building stayed awake. Ventilation fans whispered above me. A distant pump clicked on and off at regular intervals. Every sound had a place in my mental map of the facility. When you work alone long enough, you learn the difference between noise and meaning. That night, everything sounded right. I checked the furnace assigned for the cycle. The door was cool to the touch, the reinforced glass clear and unclouded. I ran my eyes over the seals, the hinges, the locking mechanism. Years in the job had trained me to notice the smallest irregularities. A hairline crack, a faint discoloration, a screw that didn't sit quite flush. There were none. The control panel lit up as soon as I keyed in my credentials. Green indicators bloomed across the display. Internal pressure stable. Oxygen levels within range. Temperature climbing at exactly the rate the manual specified. It was the kind of flawless startup technicians dream about. I stood there longer than necessary watching the numbers rise, not because I was concerned but because it was reassuring. Order has a beauty to it when you've chosen a life surrounded by endings. The furnace didn't care who it was processing. It didn't remember. It didn't judge. It simply converted matter from one state to another and moved on. I logged the start time. Initialed the form. Slid the clipboard back into its slot. There was nothing left to do but wait. Night work has a way of stretching time. Without phone calls or coworkers to break the silence, minutes can feel like hours, and hours can collapse into something almost weightless. I made myself a cup of coffee that tasted faintly burnt, sat at the small desk near the furnace room, and listened to the building continue its quiet work around me. Every so often I glanced at the monitor. The numbers held steady. No fluctuations. No alerts. The system was performing exactly as it had thousands of times before. I remember thinking how strange it was that people feared places like this. How imagination filled the empty spaces with things that had no reason to be there. In my experience, the real danger came from complacency, not the unknown. Machines didn't lie. They either worked or they didn't. That belief settled over me like a blanket. At some point, I stood and walked back into the furnace room, drawn more by habit than necessity. The flames inside had reached full intensity, bathing the chamber in a steady orange glow. Through the reinforced glass, everything looked calm, controlled, contained. I didn't feel watched. I didn't feel uneasy. I felt bored. The kind of boredom that comes from competence. From knowing exactly what will happen next and when it will happen. I leaned against the opposite wall, arms crossed, letting the heat seep through the air without ever touching me. The glass did its job just as it always had. I checked my watch. Plenty of time left in the cycle. That's the part that still unsettles me now, not what I felt but what I didn't. There was no sense of dread. No warning prickle along my skin. No instinct telling me to step away or pay closer attention. If anything, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The night was unfolding precisely according to plan. The kind of shift you don't remember afterward because there's nothing to remember. Nothing wrong with the equipment. Nothing wrong with the readings. Nothing wrong with the room. The crematorium was doing exactly what it had been built to do, and I trusted it completely. I turned my back on the furnace and walked away, certain that the rest of the night would pass just as uneventfully as it had begun. I didn't know then that this was the last moment of true normalcy I would experience inside that building. The last time, nothing wrong meant what I thought it meant. I don't know exactly how much time passed before I noticed it. That's the unsettling part. There was no sharp moment, no clear before and after. Just a gradual awareness, like realizing a sound has been playing in the background long enough that its absence would feel louder than its presence. I had returned to the furnace room out of habit. A routine check. Nothing more. The cycle was still running smoothly, the control panel confirming what I already knew. Stable temperature, steady burn, no alerts. The kind of perfect operation that barely deserved a second glance. I stood in front of the reinforced glass, hands resting loosely at my sides, watching the flames fold and unfurl inside the chamber. Fire has a way of hypnotizing you, especially when you've learned to see it as a tool rather than a threat. The movement was predictable, almost comforting. That's when I shifted my weight. Just a small adjustment, 1 foot to the left, shoulders angling slightly as I leaned in to read a number reflected faintly on the glass. I'd done it 1,000 times before without thinking. But the reflection didn't move when I did. Not right away. It wasn't frozen. It wasn't wrong in a way that jumped out at me. It lagged. The faint outline of my body in the glass followed a fraction of a second behind my actual movement, like a delayed video feed struggling to keep up. I frowned and straightened, then leaned again, testing it. The same thing happened. The flames continued their steady dance. The gauges glowed calmly. Nothing else in the room changed. Only the reflection responded late, as if the glass needed extra time to decide what it was seeing. My first thought was fatigue. Night shifts will do that to you. Your eyes play tricks. Depth perception falters. I stepped back and rubbed at my face, blinking hard, letting the harsh overhead lights reset my vision. When I looked again, everything seemed normal. The reflection matched me perfectly. No delay. No distortion. I almost laughed. I told myself it was the coffee, or the boredom, or the simple fact that staring into moving fire long enough can make anyone question what they're seeing. The mind wants patterns. It invents them when things get too quiet. Satisfied, I turned away. 2 steps. That's all I managed before something pulled my attention back. Not a sound, not a movement, but a wrongness I couldn't name. The kind that settles between your shoulders, urging you to look again even when there's no rational reason to do so. I faced the glass once more. This time I didn't move at all. I stood perfectly still, shoulders squared, breathing slow and measured, watching the faint reflection of myself layered over the burning chamber. For several seconds nothing happened. The image held steady, a mirror of my posture. Then, impossibly, it shifted. Not my reflection, something in it. The outline wavered just enough to notice. As if the version of me in the glass had swayed forward slightly, closing a distance I hadn't moved through. The delay was subtle, but it was there. A soft misalignment, like 2 frames of reality failing to line up. My pulse picked up. I leaned closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating through the glass, and watched carefully. The reflection leaned too, but not at the same time. It followed again, that same fraction of a second behind, as though the glass were remembering me instead of reflecting me. That's not possible, I muttered, the words sounding strange in the empty room. Reinforced furnace glass is thick, layered, engineered to withstand extreme heat and pressure. It doesn't bend light that way. It doesn't create latency. And even if it did, it wouldn't do so selectively. Everything in the reflection would be affected equally. But the flames were sharp. The room behind me was crisp. Only my image hesitated. I stepped back sharply this time, heart thudding harder than I liked. The reflection snapped back into place, perfectly synchronized once more. The moment passed so cleanly it almost erased itself, leaving me standing there with nothing but my own unease to explain the interruption. I checked the lighting. Overhead fluorescent steady. No flicker. No power fluctuation. I wiped the glass with my sleeve, half expecting to find a smudge or residue that could distort the image. The surface was smooth. Cool. Flawless. I forced myself to breathe normally and glanced at the control panel again, grounding myself in numbers and readouts. Everything was within tolerance. Everything was exactly as it should be. That should have been enough. But I couldn't shake the sense that I had witnessed something out of order, not broken, not malfunctioning, just misaligned. As though the furnace room had briefly slipped half a step out of time and then corrected itself. I stood there longer than I should have, testing small movements. A tilt of the head. A shift of the shoulders. Each time the reflection matched me precisely. No delay. No drift. It was as if the glass had decided to behave again. The rational part of my mind seized on that. Whatever I'd seen, it wasn't happening now. There was no data to support it. No repeatable result. In my line of work, if you couldn't reproduce a problem, you didn't have one. Still, I found myself stepping back, increasing the distance between me and the furnace. I didn't like how close I'd been. Didn't like how natural it had felt to stand there, waiting for the glass to respond. I told myself it was nothing. A trick of light. A tired brain. A long night. And yet, as I turned away, I had the distinct impression that something behind the glass had just finished catching up to where I was. Not copying me anymore, but waiting to see what I'd do next. I left the furnace room telling myself I needed distance, not answers. That's how you stay sane in a job like that, by trusting process over perception. What I'd seen in the glass had no physical explanation, but it also had no proof. No data. No record. And in my world, anything without numbers behind it was just noise. So I went back to the control panel. The soft hum of the equipment followed me, steady and familiar, grounding. The monitor glowed at eye level, a grid of readings updating in real time. Temperature curve rising exactly as expected. Pressure stable. Oxygen levels locked in. Every metric sat comfortably inside its green band. Perfect. I felt a small wave of relief. Machines didn't care about reflections. They didn't imagine delays. They measured reality as it was, not as it felt. If something were wrong, the system would tell me. I stood there watching the readouts tick forward, each second logged and archived. My breathing slowed. My shoulders relaxed. Whatever had happened in front of the glass, it hadn't affected the furnace. That mattered. Then the temperature dropped. Not dramatically. Not enough to trigger an alarm. Just a brief dip, 5 maybe 6 degrees, before climbing back to where it belonged. The change happened quickly, a soft downward blip in an otherwise flawless line. I stared at it, unsure if I'd really seen it. Temperature fluctuations happen during startup or shutdown, not mid-cycle. Once the burn stabilizes, the system compensates automatically. A dip like that shouldn't exist without a cause, and if there were a cause, the panel would flag it. It didn't. I leaned closer to the screen, scrolling through the data history. The line smoothed itself out as if the drop had never happened, the software correcting the curve into something clean and acceptable. No warning. No error code. Just a quiet insistence that everything was normal. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I pulled up the secondary diagnostics, then the tertiary. Independent sensors confirmed the same story. Stable. Within range. No anomalies detected. That's not right, I said, more to the room than to myself. I checked the timestamps, wondering if I'd misread the display or caught a refresh glitch. The numbers updated again, steady as ever. If the dip had occurred, it had vanished into the system's interpretation of acceptable behavior. A small knot tightened in my chest. I've seen equipment fail before. Burned out sensors. Corrupted logs. Power fluctuations that ripple through a system like a cough. But those failures leave fingerprints. They don't erase themselves. I walked back toward the furnace, slower this time, aware of my own footsteps echoing too loudly in the empty building. The air felt warmer than before, not hotter exactly but heavier, as if the heat weren't rising the way it should. The furnace door radiated its usual warmth. The glass showed nothing but flame. No lag. No distortion. Just fire doing what fire does. I placed my palm flat against the metal frame, grounding myself in the sensation. Solid. Real. The kind of contact you trust. Behind me, the ventilation fan shifted pitch. It was subtle, but I noticed it immediately. The airflow pattern changed, not in speed but in direction, as if the system had momentarily rerouted. I turned my head, listening, waiting for the sound to correct itself. It didn't. The air in the room pressed inward, thick and resistant, making each breath feel slightly more deliberate. Not suffocating. Just occupied. Like stepping into a space where someone else has been standing for too long. I checked the oxygen levels again. Normal. Pressure readings. Normal. I told myself the sensation was psychological. The human body reacts to uncertainty in strange ways. You feel weight where there is none. Presence where there's only expectation. Still, I found myself stepping back, widening the space between me and the furnace without consciously deciding to do so. I returned to the control panel and pulled the raw sensor data, the unfiltered stream the software usually smooths out for readability. The numbers flickered across the screen, messy and granular, every micro-adjustment laid bare. There it was. Another dip. Smaller than the first. Faster. Barely there. But real. My stomach tightened. The system corrected it almost immediately, compensating before any alarm could register. On paper, nothing had gone wrong. In practice, something was actively being adjusted. By what, I couldn't say. I ran through the possibilities. Fuel variance. Ambient temperature shift. Software interpolation error. Each explanation collapsed under scrutiny. None of them accounted for the timing, or the way the room itself seemed to respond when the numbers changed. The furnace wasn't failing. It was reacting. That thought settled into me with quiet force. Machines don't react unless they're responding to an input. A variable. Something changing inside the system that isn't accounted for in the model. I stood there, watching the data scroll, my reflection faintly visible in the darkened screen. For a moment, I had the irrational urge to look behind me, to confirm I was still alone in the room. I didn't want to validate the feeling that the space had begun to close ranks around me. That the furnace room had developed a kind of awareness. Not conscious, not alive, but attentive in a way that defied classification. The numbers continued to lie politely, insisting everything was fine. And for the first time in my career, I understood something that terrified me more than any malfunction ever could. If the machines couldn't be trusted to tell the truth, then whatever was happening that night didn't need to hide. There are written rules in this job, and there are the others. The ones no manual bothers to explain because they don't sound professional. They get passed down quietly, during late shifts and half-finished coffee, as advice rather than instruction. You don't laugh at them, but you don't ask too many questions either. One of those rules is simple. Don't stand in front of the glass longer than you have to. No one ever told me why. Not in so many words. The explanation was always practical. Heat exposure, eye strain, complacency. Reasonable things. Sensible things. And for years that was enough. That night it wasn't. After watching the numbers smooth themselves into lies, after feeling the air press in around the furnace like a held breath, I should have walked away. I should have documented what little I could and finished the cycle from a distance. Instead, I went back to the glass. I told myself I needed confirmation. A visual check to match the data. That's how professionals think. You verify. You cross-reference. You don't let one strange reading dictate your actions. I stood closer than before. The warmth soaked into my skin immediately, not painfully but insistently. The flames inside the chamber burned steady and bright, folding over themselves in patterns I'd seen countless times. The glass reflected my face faintly, pale and layered over the fire, my features blurred by heat shimmer. I stayed still. No testing movements. No leaning in or stepping back. I planted my feet and waited, watching the reflection without focusing on any one detail. That's another trick you learn over time: peripheral awareness. Letting your eyes soften so you catch changes without forcing them. Seconds passed. Nothing happened. My shoulders loosened despite myself. The room felt quieter somehow, as if the ventilation had lowered its voice. The pressure in the air eased just enough to make me doubt I'd imagined it in the first place. Then I became aware of time doing something strange. It didn't slow. It didn't speed up. It simply stopped feeling like time. The steady rhythm I'd lived by, the ticking clock, the rising temperature curve, lost its grip on my senses. The moment stretched, elastic and directionless. The reflection shifted. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. It didn't jump or blur or distort in any obvious way. It leaned forward just a fraction, like someone tilting their head to listen better. I didn't move. I told myself not to. The reflection continued to exist half a step ahead of me now, no longer lagging behind. The delay I'd noticed earlier had reversed itself, subtle enough that I questioned my own perception even as my heart began to pound. My mouth went dry. I could see my eyes in the glass, or something shaped like them, focused intently on the space where I stood. The flames behind that gaze burned on, indifferent, as if they were simply a backdrop for something else entirely. "This isn't happening," I whispered. The words sounded wrong in the room, too loud and too small at the same time. The sound didn't echo the way it should have. It seemed to fall flat, absorbed by the space between me and the furnace. The reflection's mouth didn't move. That was the moment I understood the rule. It wasn't about heat. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't even about superstition. It was about attention. Standing there, staring into that glass, I had crossed from observation into acknowledgement. Whatever boundary existed between the controlled interior of the chamber and the room around it had thinned, not because something pushed through, but because I had leaned in too far. The air thickened again, heavier than before. Each breath felt deliberate, chosen. The warmth intensified, not from the furnace, but from the space itself, as if the room had begun to hold heat differently. I felt watched. Not by eyes. Not by a presence I could point to. By the furnace as a whole. By the system. By something aware of patterns and deviations, of rules followed and rules broken. My reflection lifted a hand. I did not. The movement was slight, barely more than a suggestion, but it was enough. A hand where my hand wasn't. A gesture that didn't belong to me. I stepped back. The moment I did, the room snapped back into place. The air loosened. The pressure eased. The reflection realigned with my body as if nothing had happened at all. I stumbled against the opposite wall, heart hammering so hard it made my vision pulse. I didn't look back at the glass right away. I couldn't. I stood there with my palms flat against the cool metal behind me, grounding myself in its solidity, forcing my breathing to slow. When I finally dared to look again, the furnace showed only fire. Perfectly normal. Perfectly contained. No hand. No gaze. No sign that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. But I knew better. Rules don't exist without reason. They're shaped by experience, by mistakes repeated often enough to become warnings. Somewhere, long before I took that job, someone had learned what happens when you linger too long in front of the glass. And now, so had I. I didn't approach the furnace again for the rest of the cycle. I monitored the numbers from a distance, eyes flicking between screens, every muscle in my body tight with restraint. Because I understood something then that I hadn't before. The furnace didn't need to reach out. All it needed was for me to stand still long enough to notice. The cycle ended without ceremony. No alarms. No sudden changes in sound. Just the soft, familiar shift in the furnace's tone as the system transitioned from active burn to cool down. If I hadn't been watching the clock, I might have missed it entirely. That felt wrong. After everything that had happened, the glass, the numbers, the pressure in the air, I expected something dramatic. A failure. a warning light, anything that acknowledged the tension coiled through my body. Instead, the crematorium behaved as if the night had been perfectly ordinary. I stayed where I was, several yards back from the furnace, until the control panel confirmed it was safe to approach. The green indicators blinked in their usual sequence, each one a quiet reassurance I no longer trusted. When the final light came on, signaling completion, I hesitated. This was the moment I'd been trained for. The part of the job I knew by heart. Open the chamber. Assess the remains. Begin cleanup. I told myself there was nothing to be afraid of. Whatever I'd experienced hadn't changed the fundamentals. Heat reduces. Matter settles. Physics doesn't bend for feelings. I walked forward. The air near the furnace felt cooler now, the intense warmth replaced by a residual heat that radiated gently through the metal. The reinforced glass was dark, the flames long gone. My reflection stared back at me clearly, perfectly synchronized with my movements. No delay. No misalignment. I almost convinced myself it had all been a stress response. A tired mind filling empty space with meaning. The human tendency to invent patterns when confronted with silence. I released the latch and pulled the heavy door open. The chamber was empty. Not clean, empty. Ash lay scattered across the metal floor, but not in the quantity it should have been. I leaned in, squinting, my brain scrambling to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew should be there. After a full cycle, the remains should have been unmistakable. That's present. A clear outcome of time and temperature. This was sparse. Too sparse. I stepped closer, heart beating faster, and scanned the chamber carefully. The distribution was wrong. Thin. As if something had been removed, or never fully been there to begin with. The walls bore the usual discoloration from heat, but the floor held only a light dusting of ash, spread unevenly, like residue after something had passed through rather than settled. That's not possible, I said, my voice low and unsteady. I checked the interior again, forcing myself to be methodical. No hidden corners. No mechanical malfunction that could account for material loss. The chamber was intact. The seals unbroken. The system hadn't failed. It had completed the cycle. A chill crept up my spine that had nothing to do with temperature. I backed away from the open door, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt standing there. The room seemed larger than before, the distances stretched in ways that made it hard to judge where I was in relation to anything else. Then I noticed the floor. A faint line of ash trailed away from the furnace, drifting across the smooth concrete behind me. It wasn't scattered randomly the way residue usually is when disturbed. It had direction. A subtle curve, like something had moved through it intentionally. I turned slowly, following the trail. The ash gathered near the doorway of the furnace room, thickening just slightly as if drawn there. I crouched and brushed my fingers through it, expecting it to disperse easily. It didn't. The particles clung together, resisting the airflow from the ventilation system that should have pushed them away. They moved against the current, sliding almost imperceptibly toward the hall beyond. My breath caught. Ash doesn't behave like that. I stood abruptly, my heart pounding in my ears, and took a step back. The movement disturbed the air, and for a moment the ash lifted, swirling gently before settling again, closer to the door this time. Leaving. I didn't follow it. Every instinct screamed at me to stay where I was, to not acknowledge what I was seeing. The memory of the glass, of the way attention itself seemed to change the room, flashed through my mind. Instead, I closed the furnace door. The heavy metal sealed shut with a solid, final sound that echoed too loudly in the empty space. I secured the latch and stepped away, forcing myself to look at the control panel rather than the floor. Cycle complete. All systems normal. The words blurred together. I finished the cleanup process mechanically, my movements stiff and deliberate. I documented the cycle without elaboration, writing only what the system allowed me to write. No notes. No comments. No questions. I didn't trust myself to put anything else on paper. The ash trail was gone by the time I looked again. The floor was clean, undisturbed, as if nothing had ever moved across it. The ventilation hummed steadily overhead, doing its quiet work. I stood alone in the furnace room long after everything was finished, listening to the building settle. My hands shook slightly and I clenched them into fists to hide it. The cycle had ended. That was the part that terrified me most. Whatever had been present that night hadn't interrupted the process. It hadn't forced itself into existence or torn through the system in a way that could be blamed on malfunction. It had followed the rules. It had waited until the fire was done. And then it had left, taking with it something I couldn't name, something the machines insisted had never existed at all. I shut off the lights in the furnace room and walked away without looking back. Somewhere behind me, the crematorium continued to hum, calm and orderly, as if it were satisfied with the outcome. As if the night had gone exactly as planned. I finished my shift without telling anyone. That decision wasn't brave or calculated. It was instinctive, the same kind of instinct that tells you not to shout in a place where sound feels unwelcome. The crematorium had gone quiet after the cycle ended, settling into its usual nighttime rhythm, and I followed it, moving carefully, deliberately, as if noise itself might undo whatever fragile balance had returned. I sat at the small desk near the control room and stared at the logbook. The page waited for me, clean and empty except for the printed headings. Date, time, chamber number, cycle status. Everything I was required to record fit neatly into a handful of boxes. There was no box for absence. No line for material discrepancy. No checkbox for ash behaving against airflow. And certainly no space to explain that the machines had worked perfectly while reality had not. I wrote what the system told me to write. Cycle complete. No errors detected. All readings within normal parameters. The pen moved smoothly across the paper, my handwriting steady despite the tension crawling beneath my skin. When I finished, I closed the book and slid it back into its place, the soft thud of the cover sounding louder than it should have. I didn't go back into the furnace room. I didn't need to. Whatever had happened there was finished, at least for now. I could feel it in the way the building had relaxed, the pressure easing from the air, the sense of attention fading into something dull and distant. The rest of the night passed slowly. I sat alone, listening to the ventilation fans cycle on and off, watching the clock creep toward morning. Every sound made me pause, but nothing followed through. No footsteps. No shifts in temperature. No signs that the room behind me was anything other than empty. That should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like waiting in the aftermath of a question that hadn't been answered. When my shift finally ended, dawn was just beginning to color the sky outside the narrow windows. The fluorescent lights flickered off one by one as I shut down non-essential systems, leaving the building bathed in the cool, gray light of early morning. I hesitated at the door, hand resting on the handle, and looked back one last time. The crematorium looked exactly the way it always had. Clean. So ordinary. A place defined by function, not mystery. If I hadn't lived through the night, I would have sworn nothing unusual had ever happened within those walls. I locked up and walked to my car without incident. The drive home felt unreal, like transitioning between worlds. Traffic lights changed on schedule. Other cars passed me on the road. Life continued at a pace that felt almost insulting in its normalcy. I didn't sleep when I got home. I lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of my own house, waiting for something, anything, to confirm that the night had been real. But the morning unfolded without interruption. Sunlight filled the room. The phone didn't ring. By the time I reported back for my next shift, I'd almost convinced myself it had all been a stress-induced hallucination. An accumulation of fatigue and isolation manifesting in ways my mind could barely process. Almost. The control panel told the same story it always had. Data logs showed a flawless cycle. The temperature curve was smooth, uninterrupted, a perfect arc of compliance. If I hadn't known better, I would have said it was one of the cleanest runs on record. I pulled up the raw sensor data again, hoping, against my better judgment, to find something I'd missed. There was nothing. No dips. No anomalies. No trace of the adjustments I'd seen in real time. It was as if the system had rewritten its own memory, smoothing over any deviation until only perfection remained. I considered telling my supervisor. I pictured the conversation, the careful phrasing, the emphasis on sensations rather than accusations, the inevitable pause as he weighed my words against the immaculate data in front of him. I knew how it would end. Everything looks normal. Probably just a long night. Get some rest. He wouldn't be wrong. Not according to the records. So I stayed quiet. Days passed. Then weeks. No further incidents occurred in that chamber. The furnace behaved. The glass reflected reality as expected. The air moved as it should. Every system insisted that nothing had ever gone wrong. That silence became its own kind of presence. I stopped trusting reassurance. Each quiet night felt like borrowed time, calm not because nothing was there, but because whatever had been there no longer needed my attention. Or worse, had learned it didn't have to announce itself at all. I still worked my shifts. I still followed procedure. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. Because I learned that night that the most frightening outcome isn't disaster or chaos. It's silence. When nothing breaks. When no alarms sound. When the machines agree with each other and reality quietly disagrees. And no one else ever knows enough to ask why. I still work there. That's usually the part people find hardest to understand when I finally tell this story. They expect a clean break, a resignation letter slid across a desk, a last look over the shoulder, a promise never to return. That's how stories like this are supposed to end. Mine didn't. I kept the job because, on paper, there was no reason not to. The crematorium remained exactly what it had always been. A building of steel and concrete, governed by procedures and schedules, audited and inspected like any other industrial facility. Nothing changed in the logs. Nothing changed in the equipment. Nothing changed that anyone else could see. Only the way I moved through it did. I stopped working alone whenever I could help it. When a night shift was unavoidable, I made sure someone else was in the building, even if they were stationed on the opposite end. The presence didn't make me feel safer in the way you might expect, but it anchored the space to something human, something observable. I no longer stood in front of the furnace glass unless it was absolutely necessary. When I did, I kept my distance. One step back, then another. I learned exactly how far I could stand and still do my job without feeling that subtle pull, that quiet invitation to linger. I treated the glass the way you treat deep water, with respect and without curiosity. The machines never objected. They continued to operate flawlessly. Cycles began and ended on schedule. Ash behaved the way ash should. The ventilation hummed. The numbers told their neat, reassuring stories. But I stopped believing that was the whole truth. Something had shifted in my understanding of the place. I realized the crematorium wasn't just a machine, it was a system. A closed environment designed to contain transformation, to manage the moment where one state becomes another. Time. Reduction. Finality. Or so I'd thought. After that night, I started noticing things I'd previously dismissed. How the building seemed to settle differently after certain cycles. How the silence sometimes felt heavier in specific rooms, as if sound itself hesitated before filling the space. How the air near the furnaces could feel strangely attentive, even when everything else was still. Nothing dramatic. Nothing I could point to and say there, that's it. Just enough to remind me that order doesn't always mean control. I never spoke about what happened, not to my supervisor, not to my coworkers, not to the few friends who knew what I did for a living. Words felt inadequate and explanations felt dangerous. Once you give a thing a shape, you invite it to solidify. Some nights, while walking the halls, I'd catch my reflection in polished metal or darkened glass and feel a brief flicker of unease, not because it lagged or moved on its own, but because it didn't. It behaved perfectly. Too perfectly. That's when I understood something else. The night that changed me hadn't been about fear. Not really. Fear is loud. Fear announces itself. It demands attention. What I'd encountered was quieter. It was patience. Whatever had been present didn't force its way into my world. It didn't disrupt the cycle or leave evidence behind. It observed. It waited. It allowed the process to finish before making itself known, and then it withdrew without resistance. That restraint haunted me more than any imagined violence ever could. Years have passed since then. I've trained new attendants, watched them develop the same calm confidence I once had. I hear myself giving the same advice my predecessors gave me, about procedures, about safety, about not lingering where you don't need to. I never explain why. Some lessons aren't meant to be taught directly. They're learned through proximity, through experience, through that brief moment when you realize the rules exist for reasons that aren't written down. I still trust machines. I still believe in systems and structure and process. I have to. Without that trust, the work becomes impossible. But I also know now that systems can be complete without being closed. That a process can finish without accounting for everything it has touched. That night didn't convince me that something evil lives in the crematorium. It convinced me of something far more unsettling. That there are things which move comfortably within our most controlled environments, not because they break the rules but because the rules were never meant to stop them. And if you're careful, if you keep your distance, follow procedure, and never stand in front of the glass longer than you have to, you can work there for years without ever noticing them at all. I almost did. And sometimes, when the building is quiet and the machines are humming just right, I still get the sense that something remembers the moment I stood still long enough to notice back. That it knows I'm still there. Working. Waiting. Just like it is.